Public service these days is not easy. As you all know, it's a very difficult time to be in public service. Americans don't like people in public service. They like their individual representatives, but they don't like Congress. They don't like the legislature. They don't like the presidency. And we know why. It's a frustrating time in so many ways. And that's the topic that we're going to kind of talk about today. What does it mean to represent Fort Worth?
I've lived here all my life, and so to represent this community is a huge honor for me. But I really didn't realize what Fort Worth, how unique Fort Worth was until I served as mayor and on the board of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And when I'd go to those meetings, the mayors would talk about their cities and their constituents, and it was a constant complaint, you know, what they didn't do or what they asked of the mayors. And it really puzzled me because I always talked about our solutions and our success from Fort Worth. And it really made me realize that we are different, and part of it is the way we treat our elected officials. And I tell people about Fort Worth, I said, in Fort Worth, if you're elected, if people elect you, they expect you to be good. They expect you to lead, and they expect you to have vision, and they expect you to reach out to everyone. So that expectation, instead of having to prove yourself all the time when you're first elected, you have to live up to what this community expects of you. And that is a wonderful, wonderful way to come in office. And I think that expectation of you're going to be good and we're going to support you even when you have to make some tough decisions has led us to have great leaders. And one of them's right here, Bob Boland, who was very instrumental in helping me along. I say in Fort Worth, if we believe there's a problem, we'll fix it. Now we have to be convinced, but if we say that's a problem in this city, we'll find the solution, whether it's money, whether it's change procedures, whatever it is, and you can bring all the people together, which is unusual. I think the other thing that's unique about Fort Worth is the huge leadership bank we have from business people and neighborhoods that you can always bring people together. When I served as mayor in that difficult time where we had all the defense downsizing, I said, I'm not smart enough to figure out how to get us out of here, but I can work with the rest of you, helping me figure out what it's going to take to get out of this. And the help was always there. So it's not just writing a check, it's the help of finding solutions to problems and moving us forward, and that's why we've been a great community.
Thank you, Kay. I couldn't agree more with you. I think as elected officials, we were, the three of us, very fortunate to grow up in Fort Worth and be shaped by the traditions of public service in this community. And when you see what's going on in Washington today and in Austin more so, and I'm very much looking forward to Wendy talking about what is going on in Austin today, but you see that the traditions of Fort Worth really stand in stark contrast to what you see most other places. And I don't think until I went to Washington, frankly, that I appreciated the traditions that we had, and certainly not unique, but how unusual they are in the political world. But when we talk today about partisanship and civility, two different terms, but in many ways they're linked together, but they're different. You can be partisan and you can be civil. I think back on what I saw in Congress. Speaker Wright, partisan certainly, as the Speaker of the House, the leader of the Democrats. His dear friend was Bob Michael, the minority leader. Dear friendship throughout their time in Congress. Partisan certainly. Felt deeply about the issues that they advanced, but remained civil throughout. The friendship between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill is legendary, how they would gather together at night and drink in the White House. Certainly partisan. Very complete different ends of the political spectrum. But they got along. They valued each other. I read recently about Lyndon Johnson when he signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The first pen after he signed it, he turned and gave it to Everett Dirksen, Republican senator from Illinois, the minority leader. That sort of bipartisan tradition is a long-standing tradition here in Fort Worth. And the civility is as well. You only have to look 30 miles down the road to the east to see the contrast between what public life is like there and what public life is like here. But bipartisan, I grew up, Jim Wright was our congressman. He wasn't our Democratic congressman, he was Fort Worth's congressman. I hope when I was in Congress that you felt the same way. I know we feel the same way about Kay. She's not our Republican congresswoman, or she's just our congresswoman. Wendy Davis wouldn't have won her election if it hadn't gotten a lot of Republican votes. That's just the way we do it in Fort Worth. And the civility that really is just a part of the way we operate. You watch our city council, you watch our county commissioners, with very few exceptions, you watch our school board. The tradition here is you work things out together. And it really does stand in stark contrast to what you see on the public stage today. And it's a tragedy. What's happening today is tearing at the fabric of not just political life, of public life. I don't know why we've been so blessed to be different as a community, but it has served us well. And it has allowed us to work through some very difficult issues as a community and as a region, and come through it together and not torn apart. All of us, I think, in this room, and certainly those of us who've had the privilege of serving elected office have been very much blessed by growing up in this tradition of bipartisanship, in fact, no partisanship, and civility. And I just, real quickly, I think about Mayor Bolin. Mayor Bolin is a Republican. He wasn't a Republican mayor. Our current mayor, Republican, you don't think about that as Betsy Price as a Republican mayor, nor did you think of Mike Moncrief as a Democratic mayor or Kenneth Barr as a Democratic mayor. They're mayors of the city of Fort Worth. And that stands in contrast, I can assure you, to most cities in America, even cities that claim to have nonpartisan elected officials at the local level. So we're very fortunate, and it has shaped, I think, all of ours approach to politics as well as your approach to politics. Thank you.
Well, I couldn't agree more with what Kay and Pete have said about Fort Worth as a unique community to represent. I have a hard time, and I'm sure Kay struggles with this as well, reminding myself to talk about the fact that I represent Tarrant County, because I'm prone to say that I represent Fort Worth. It's the place that I identify with, of course, most strongly because I've lived here most of my life, and because I had the opportunity to serve this community on the Fort Worth City Council. And as I look around the room, I see people that exemplify exactly what Pete was just talking about. I see Chancellor Kaler over there, who, of course, worked very hard as a member of our school board, the president of our school board, and guided that with distinction and with true leadership, and not at all in a way that was reflective of partisanship. Certainly Mr. Kelly, who's sitting here and whose name is hanging on the outside of the building that we're in, is representative of a distinction in politics, though he's never served himself, but certainly has been a longtime supporter of Democrats and Republicans alike in his history in the political arena. And we do operate really more as a family here in this community. We get to know each other as individuals, and we respect each other as individuals, and we see beyond party labels. It's not reflective, unfortunately, of so many communities, not just in the country, but in the state of Texas, too. I think probably the best training ground that I had the opportunity to come through, and certainly I think Kay reflects this as well, was serving on a nonpartisan local elected board, the city council. And as Pete said, Kay wasn't a Republican mayor, she was the Fort Worth mayor. I wasn't a Democratic city council person, I was a city council person. And the beauty of that level of service is that on any given Tuesday, any different assortment of 5 people might vote together to make something happen. I even voted with Chuck Silcox on a number of occasions. And I really respected him. And I think that that has really served us so well. We know each other in that capacity, and we trust each other in that capacity, and it helps us break those partisan barriers down when we talk about things. People in Fort Worth care about what everyone cares about. They care about public education. They care about making sure that we have a good, strong economy and that there are jobs for themselves and their children. They want to know that we know how to invest their tax dollars wisely in a way that helps support both of those arenas. And I think with distinction, the people that have represented this community have done that. When people asked me when I first was running for the state senate, why'd you run as a Democrat? I would try to make sure they understood what it meant to me to be a Democrat, and the way that I would do that is I would say, I'm a Pete Geren Democrat. I said that a lot. And because that says something to people. I think people understood that Pete didn't go to Congress as a partisan. He went to Congress with a certain belief system, but carried forward always in his heart the people in the community of Fort Worth, whether they were Republican or Democrat, in the work that he did there, just as Kay does in the work that she does there. What it means to be from Fort Worth is a real privilege, and I'm so happy to be here today and part of this esteemed panel.
The pictures we see of Austin and Washington these days are pictures of leaders that barely talk to each other and that are incivil to one another. I guess I want to start with the question: is it really that bad? And I'd like for you to kind of talk to what your perception of politics in Washington and Austin is right now, and then what I would really like to do is to get your perspectives, because there are kind of two ways of thinking about approaching things other than through partisanship, and you all have talked about one of them, which is non-partisanship, and so I guess I would like to ask to Kay and to Wendy, what did you learn on the Fort Worth City Council about how to make appeals in ways that can reach across party lines, or in ways that can reach out to voters and to constituents without party labels? And for Pete, I think he's a very different kind of thing, because there are also what we might call bipartisan appeals in the United States, and I think nowhere do we see that more than in the military. You know, everyone in Washington wants to support our troops and wants to support our military, and so when you're Secretary of the Army and you're going to Congress, you're making arguments about how we can achieve common goals in a bipartisan way. And so I would like to hear your reflections about those issues, if I could. And here we can have some crosstalk. So please feel free to address them in any way you would like.
Start with the city council.
Is it as bad as it looks? The answer is yes. It's every bit that bad, and it's a bad environment. It's a sad thing when you have people that are elected to find solutions, and instead we spend our time finding someone to blame. And that's what's going on. It's not fixing it. It's instead saying it's not our fault, and that's both parties. And I don't know when there's ever been a time, except, for instance, before World War II, when the issues have been any bigger. I mean, the issues are so big and so important. It's the way forward for our country. It's how we handle this financial crisis right now. It's what we're going to do to the military if we don't stop this terrible thing called sequester. But instead of doing it, instead of finding solutions, it is just, don't blame us. And they're both doing it until nothing happens, and the administration's doing the same thing. In the past, we would be brought together around a disaster. For instance, 9/11. I think we all remember 9/11 and the way we reacted. I remember coming back home from the airport, and every place you saw had flags up. People had homemade flags taped in their windows. I mean, everyone came together. Or World War II, when that terrible war, but you know, women went to work in the factories. We're not doing that today. We're not coming together, and that financial crisis we've been through. Texas didn't go through it nearly as badly as others, but we didn't come together. So that the things that have worked in the past aren't working today, and we've got to do it differently. What did I learn on the Forest City Council? Well, I learned it as mayor as we faced a very difficult time then. If you remember the defense downsizing, and Lockheed Martin laid off 20,000 people. Pete and I used to say, together with him in Congress and me as mayor, we laid off about 2,500 people a month. Isn't that right? Something like that. But it was just, we were grasping for anything we could do, and we all came together. And when that was all over, Lockheed Martin is stronger than it ever was. When they closed our base, that base has more people there today than it did when it was closed, before it closed. Very, very successful, and our economy is diverse. So we've got to somehow do that nationally and come together. To find solutions. But the crisis really is a crisis of not coming together, more than a financial crisis, I believe.
At the state legislative level, yes, it is also that bad. And if I could point to a reason that I think it's gotten to the place that it is, I would point most particularly at the evolution of what's happened through redistricting. And it's happened on both sides of the party aisle. But through redistricting, we have created these very, very purely partisan districts. They're either almost absolutely Republican or they're absolutely Democratic. And in the process of that, we've lost the ability to have a conversation in the middle, where most people are, actually. When we did our polling, for example, in the last campaign that I was in, we saw that Republican and Democrat alike, the priorities are the same. Education being priority number one, higher education, opportunity, job creation, healthcare, surprisingly, even though we think of that in very partisan terms. But in the process of redistricting, we don't have very many districts left like the one that I have the privilege to represent. I actually represent a district that most people would say leans Republican, and yet it's elected a Democrat in the last 2 state Senate cycles. It is reflective of a lost representation of what we once were as a community. Now what happens, of course, is that in election cycles, people are held accountable to the extreme edges of their party. And I think we saw that in Texas at the statewide level, the national level, and the last couple of election cycles, where the conversation has begun to move primarily in the Republican arena, because there's sort of 2 parties within the party going on there now, with the Tea Party being a part of that, and the more traditional conservative Republican member being a part of that. And conversations are being driven to an extreme place that aren't really reflective of what our community really wants to hear us talking about and working on. But the fear that happens within that sort of a dynamic as an office holder is that if you begin to bargain toward the middle, if you give ground on the extreme edge of your party, then you perhaps are subject to a vulnerability in your next election, because people will point to you and say, she worked too closely with the Republicans, or he worked too closely with the Democrats. And I think we each have to own responsibility one by one, person by person, to break through that. When I was elected to the City Council back in 1999 and raised my hand and took my oath for the first time, I made a promise to myself that day that I would never, ever, ever vote on something that I did not absolutely believe was right, and that I wouldn't ever vote on something that I didn't think was in the best interest of my community. And sometimes that's made me take some pretty hard votes. Sometimes it's made me take votes that in the campaign arena have subjected me to criticism, and yet I think it has served me very well and our community very well to not be voting in a way that's reflective of partisanship. I have the luxury of being able to do that because of the district that I represent, but it's not necessarily true elsewhere. And what we see in the Texas legislature, and I serve with some people who have been there for decades, they say it's worse than it's ever been, is that our moderate members who are threatened by what we refer to now as report card accountability. There are organizations across the state that keep report cards on whether folks are conservative enough, for example. It tends to happen more, unfortunately, to our Republican members than to our Democratic members. But if they are taking votes in a way that these report card keepers think are not reflective enough of the conservative values, and you can twist that word any way you want, they are subjected to tremendous pressure when they run in another election cycle. And it keeps them, it holds them hostage to an idealism that isn't reflective really of even who they want to be in terms of what they're voting for. I'm trying very hard this session to actively walk over to the House side and find Republican members to be co-sponsors of legislation that I'm working on. And I'm also actively looking at legislative efforts of my Republican colleagues to see where I can join with them and be helpful to them. And I hope that more and more of us will begin to do that and show the report card keepers that we are braver than that, and that we're going to break through that on behalf of the good of the people that we represent.
Jim, I don't know that, and I try to reflect back on my time in the Department of Defense, that I can speak directly to the issues that we're discussing today, but I will say, and then following on with what Kay said, that after 9/11, how the country did come together. And working in the Department of Defense at that time, I remember that evening in the Pentagon at 9/11 when we had Senator Warner and Senator Levin and Congressman Stump and Ike Skelton come over, all stood together in that press conference from inside that burning Pentagon, and gave this united front to the world that this is not a Republican country or a Democratic country. This is one country. And over the 8 years I spent, 8.5 years I spent in the Pentagon, I had the opportunity to really work on an issue that did bring the country together. And you saw the divisiveness across the river on so many issues, but our country was at war, is at war, and you saw the best of our elected officials, I believe. I think about the many days and hours I spent with the Armed Services Committees in both bodies, the Appropriations Committees that dealt with defense issues, and it was America first. It truly was. And those members were united in that common purpose, and it was, you saw that unity of purpose standing in contrast to what the rest of the Congress was going through. And it appears to me from 1,500 miles away that it's much worse now than it was then. But it was an example of how the Congress can work together. We had many hard issues, and there was considerable disagreement over what the right course of action was, and certainly in Iraq, not so much in Afghanistan. But the country did pull together, the Congress pulled together, and members of Congress that on many issues not only would have not gotten together politically, but would not have been civil to each other, when it came to the nation's defense, it did bring out the best in the Congress. So I think, as Kay was talking, over our history, there are issues that can bring us together. Some that had brought us together in the past for some reason can't seem to reach far enough now to bring us together today. And it is tearing at the social and political fabric of this country, and has great practical impact on a daily basis. But I do think you don't have to go back that far to 9/11, 2001, and America did come together. So you have to have hope that it's still possible. But I think it needs kind of leadership that helps us see the common ground that those crises do make crystal clear.
There's a member of Congress, represents Maryland. His name is Emanuel Cleaver, and Democrat, a minister. And he has family here. Reverend Cleaver is preaches at Collins Street Missionary Baptist Church. And Emanuel came to me about 3 weeks ago. He said, you know, Kay, you were a mayor and I was the mayor, and he said, as a mayor, we had to build a coalition to get done what we wanted to do. There are 9 members of 4 city council. I had 1 vote. I had to find 4 other votes, but you always want things to be more than just 5-4. But what we do is you go to members of the city council and say, what's important to you in your district? What are you trying to get done? And how can I help you as mayor? And this is what I'm trying to get done. And so you build those relationships. And Emanuel had the same experience. So we formed a group called the Working Group for a Working Congress, and said maybe we can teach those skills to other members of Congress. Many members of Congress worked as a staff person for a congressman or congresswoman, and when that person retired, they moved up in the congressional seat. They never had any experience in building that vote or that coalition, or like I did in my business of running a business and then working with different employees and putting a staff together that had different skills. And so we formed this group, and it's equal number. I chose my Republicans that from as diverse as I could think of, geographically and how conservative they were, more moderate. He did the same thing. And we decided to work within the subcommittees. And the reason we did that is because I chair a subcommittee of appropriations that does all of our foreign assistance and all of our global health and all the State Department. When I came into that subcommittee, I was the ranking member, the highest ranking minority. The woman who was chair was a woman named Nita Lowy from New York. I'd never worked with her before. She'd been on the committee for 26 years. I came in as a ranking member, never having served on it. And she said, Kay, we're going to work together. She said, I want this to be bipartisan, and I want us to work together. And so every meeting that she had, if some ambassador wanted to meet with her, she invited me. Well, then we took over the majority. So I became the chair, and she became the ranking member. And we just kept the same relationship. So we work not only in a very civil way, we really have become very close friends. And what we did is we started with what we agreed on. What did I want in that bill, and what did she want in that bill, and what did our members want? And we started with what we agreed with and built out, not what we disagreed with and had to fight over. So we still have things that I'm here and she's here, but we work it out in the bill. And we've had a bipartisan bill the whole time I've been on that subcommittee. We're going to try to do that with others and with bringing other people together, and hope it may be a small way, but I'll try anything right now.
Is this working? Yeah, now it's working. In making, I know it's pretty easy to make a bipartisan appeal when you're overseeing a military unit, because there are obvious appeals that you can make, right? National security, which is really not a partisan issue. Supporting the troops, that is not really a partisan issue. How do you frame those arguments in such a way that they might move into other areas that are partisan? So, for example, I don't know, I'm trying to pick an example that won't be too divisive, I guess. But on things like healthcare and education, how do we frame issues so that we can come together and actually reach some kind of accommodation that isn't always a 5-4 or always a party line vote?
Bill, with the Department of Defense, we're able to come together as a Congress because the common ground is easier to see and easier to understand. You've got so many factors that do bring people together. These other issues, the common ground for most Americans, I believe, is there. It requires the leadership to presented in a way where people understand the common ground in the same way that there is common ground in national security. But a point that Wendy made, with what redistricting has done, you'll have 6 or 7% of the people vote in the Republican primary and 6 or 7% of the people vote in the Democratic primary. Those tend to be the most intense partisans, and they tend to elect people that share their views. And it's hard for people from the extremes to find that common ground. It really is. It's partly, I think, a lack of leadership, but I'm not sure they can reach and touch, frankly, across the gulf that is between the two of them. In my time in politics, you always had the extremists on the far right and on the far left. Important part of the legislative process. They helped stir the pot, but they weren't in the majority. The majority was between the 40-yard lines, and those people between the 40-yard lines could find the common ground, and the people that stirred the pot on the far right and the far left, important part of the debate, important part of the political process in America, but frankly you never counted on them to make legislation. It was rare, frankly, that they were ever part of the final agreement. As Wendy pointed out, and I think it's true, increasingly true in the State House, and it's, I'm afraid, very much true on the federal level, you have people from the 20-yard lines in, and not many from the 40-yard line to the 40-yard line. So they really don't see that common ground, frankly. National defense is one of the few issues that they can identify true common ground. But if we as a country let the middle, abandon the middle as far as our elected officials, we're going to have a hard time ever legislating again. And I don't know how to recreate that. There was a recent survey that showed that the last Congress was the most polarized Congress in history. They're the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. There was a huge gulf between those two. When I was in the Congress, you had Democrats in the South that were more conservative than Republicans in the North. It's not true anymore. There's a purity there that makes it very hard to find common ground, and I would like to be able to say that I think it's just a question of leadership, a question of seeing these issues differently that could allow us to come together. But I think that the divide, we say partisan, but I think the ideological divide is greater than we have ever had, and I think that surveys would prove that out. So I have been a political optimist my whole life, but I must say I'm concerned that the opportunity to find common ground with the current makeup of our political system is not great.
I think my votes and yours when I first came in Congress were almost identical. Most of the issues, yeah. We were in that category.
And Wendy, I think you're seeing this happen before our very eyes in Austin. Mm-hmm. You don't have to go back very long ago to find a time where most of the people were in that 40-yard line to 40-yard line range.
That's right, and I think when President Bush was Governor Bush, it was such a different place. I wish I had had the opportunity to serve under him as our governor, but I've had many of my colleagues talk about what the climate of the Capitol was like at that time. He truly was a bipartisan as our governor and empowered people on both sides of the aisle to have a voice in the process, and people had a respect there for each other and for the tradition of the body, the tradition of the Senate, the tradition of the House that really isn't represented there today. There are some things that have happened in the last couple of legislative sessions that under any leadership prior would have never been allowed in terms of the breaking of tradition, the breaking of the 2/3 rule in the Senate where it suits a particular partisan purpose. It just was unheard of because what was understood always was that if one side did it, what goes around comes around, and it was going to happen eventually in a way that was harmful to that person's perspective. We do have some good examples of people who are trying to put that back in place. I particularly admire Speaker Joe Strauss, who is from San Antonio. I think he's elected in a community much like a the community that we're elected from, that is looking more at person than party. He had a very tough primary battle, someone who really spent a tremendous amount of money and effort trying to prove that he wasn't Republican enough, conservative enough, and he resoundingly was reelected in a way that confirmed, I think, that that is what people want to be seeing. And when he came back into the House this session, he immediately began by sending the signal that he was going to be about serving Texas and not serving party. He did, I think, a really commendable job of the way he appointed his committees and being very fair in that. Because I'm sitting next to his brother, I have to give a kudo to Representative Charlie Geren as well, who is one of Speaker Strauss's most trusted allies in the State House. And both of them believe in working in a way that is not about party. And with that kind of leadership, I do still have some hope. I'd like to see it return over to the Senate side. Unfortunately, I think our Lieutenant Governor coming out of the race that he came out of believes that maybe folks in Texas don't think he's conservative enough, that he's to the right enough. And I see him trying to move things that direction in a way that I think is really fractious for us. It really, at the end of the day, is the lesson, I think, to be learned from it is that elections matter, and that we have to take control in the election process again of putting us back in those 40-yard line area, as Pete said. And he's right now it seems that the folks who are most invested in coming out and turning out in elections are the ones that are on those 10-yard lines of either of our political parties. And a lot of the people in the middle of, I think, maybe just given up on the fact that it can be representative of them and their perspectives, and so they stay home. But that's really the only thing that's going to turn it around, is for the involvement of the people who are reflective of that middle ground exceeds the involvement of those who are so heavily invested on the edges.
I think there may be some hope in the Congress, and this is it, and that's over immigration reform. Mm-hmm. And in this situation, for different reasons, both parties and the administration believe it is important to take on that issue. And the last time that was attempted, the extremes of both parties took over that, and it became very ugly and accomplished really nothing. But in this case, I do see there's a bill from the Senate, there's a bill working its way, probably will be introduced when I go back on Monday from the House and also the administration, and there's some differences, but not enormous differences, and I think that may possibly, I've got to leave some hope in here for the Congress, and so I think that's possible that we will come together on that issue.